the first thing I felt was the wind change. Not the weather, the crowd. A crowd has a wind to it if you have stood in enough of them, and that morning, in the long gravel forecourt below the south face of Harrogate Palace, the wind of the crowd turned cold against the back of my neck a full second before I understood why. I was standing my post at the inner cordon, where the velvet rope met the iron stanchion, where I had stood for the better part of 2 hours while the kingdom of Eldermoor gathered to remember its dead. The remembrance of the fallen, we call it. The oldest ceremony the royal house of Harrogate keeps. Once a year on the grey edge of autumn, the whole realm draws a breath and holds it for the men and women who did not come home, and the palace opens its forecourt to anyone who wishes to lay a sprig of rosemary at the foot of the old memorial stone. Lords come. So do laundresses. So do the children of the men whose names are carved into that stone, grandchildren now, some of them, white-haired themselves. And the veterans come. That is the part of the day I had been watching, the way a man watches a thing he loves and is a little afraid of. They had begun arriving at first light, the old soldiers, in their coats that no longer quite fit, with their medals pinned in straight lines and their canes and their slow, careful steps over the gravel. We had set chairs for them along the eastern wall, in the thin sun, and a young footman went up and down the line of them with a tray of warm cider, and they sat there talking to one another in the low, private way of men who share a country no one else can enter. I had picked one of them out without meaning to. You always do. There is always one your eye goes back to. His name, I would learn within the hour, was Corwin Vale, though at that moment he was only the smallest and the straightest of the old men, a man so frail that the wind seemed a personal enemy to him, wrapped in a faded blue greatcoat 2 sizes too large, with a row of 3 medals on his chest and a 4th, the one that mattered, the one with the dark ribbon hanging a little apart from the others, the way the great ones are always set apart. He had no cane. He stood when the others sat, near the head of the line, very near the rope, looking up at the memorial stone with his cap in both hands. He had taken his cap off the moment he came through the gate, and he had not put it back on, though the morning was bitter and his bare head shone pale in the cold light. He held it against his chest, with both hands the way you hold something you are giving back. I did not know his story then. I knew only that he was a man who had decided, a long time ago, exactly how he was going to stand at this stone, and that he was standing that way now, and that nothing on this earth was going to make him put his cap back on his head while he did it. So when the wind of the crowd turned cold, my eyes were already near him, and I saw the trouble before it had finished becoming trouble. It came from the public side of the rope, from the press of ordinary people in their good dark coats, and it came in the shape of a big young man pushing through them the wrong way. That is the first thing a guardsman learns to read direction. Everyone in a crowd is going the same way, slow, patient, with the current. The dangerous one is the one cutting across it, and this one was cutting across it hard, shouldering a woman aside, knocking a sprig of rosemary out of an old hand, his head down and his shoulders working. A big square-built man in a green jacket too thin for the day, with a face the color of a man who has been drinking and arguing since the night before, and has not yet found the fight he is looking for. He found it at the rope. He found it, I understood with a lurch, in the line of old men along the eastern wall, and at the head of that line stood Corwin Vale, bareheaded, his cap against his chest, his 3 medals and his 1 dark ribbon catching the thin sun. I had perhaps 4 seconds. I want to be honest about that, here at the start, because everything that I am going to tell you turns on those 4 seconds and on what a man does with them. 4 seconds is not long. It is long enough to do the wrong thing in a dozen ways. It is long enough to shout, which would have started a stampede. It is long enough to draw, which a guardsman does not do at a remembrance for the dead unless the dead are about to have company. It is long enough to freeze, which is the thing that everyone watching expected of me, because that is what the king's guard is, the man who does not move. I will tell you what I did with my 4 seconds, but not yet. First, I want you to see what I saw, because if you do not see it, you will not understand why I did what I did, and you will think it was easy, and it was not easy. Nothing about that morning was easy. The easy thing would have been to be a statue. The whole world thinks the statue is the hard part. The statue is the easy part. The statue is what you do when nothing is asked of you. The big man hit the rope and the rope held. Those iron stanchions are set in lead. They will hold a horse. And the check of it threw him forward at the waist, so that for a moment he was bent over the rope into the cordon ground, into our ground, the palace ground, the ground I was sworn to, and his face came up, and I saw his eyes go down the line of old men and stop. They stopped on Corwin Vale, on the bareheaded little man with the medals, on the one with the dark ribbon set apart. You, the big man said, just that at first, you. And he came over the rope. He did not climb it. He half fell over it, one heavy boot catching the velvet and dragging the stanchion a hand's width across the gravel with a screech that I felt in my teeth. And then he was inside. He was on the palace side. He was 11 strides from the line of chairs and the old men in them, and the smallest, straightest one standing at the head of the line, with his cap held against his chest like an offering. The crowd made a sound, not a scream yet, a kind of inrush, 1,000 people pulling breath at once, the sound a fire makes when a door is opened on it. Somewhere a woman said no, no, very quietly, the way you say it to a thing you cannot stop. The footman with the cider tray had gone the color of the cider. Down the eastern wall the old men were rising, the ones who could rise slow, their hands going out, and that was its own kind of terror, old men trying to stand fast enough to help, knowing they could not, their faces full of a thing worse than fear, which is the memory of when they could have. And Corwin Vale did not move at all. That was the thing that undid me, if I am honest, the thing that turned the 4 seconds from arithmetic into something else. He did not flinch. He did not raise his cap or his hands or step back into the protection of the chairs. He stood exactly as he had been standing, bareheaded, cap to his chest, and he looked at the big man coming, and there was no fear in his face. There was something far older and far worse than fear. There was a kind of patience. The patience of a man who has stood in front of charging things before, long ago, in a place none of us could follow him to, and has decided again, the way he decided then, that he is not going to run. He was 81 years old. He weighed, I would guess, 9 stone in that enormous coat, and he had made up his mind to take it standing, whatever it was, the way he had taken everything else. The big man drew his arm back. A fist, low and from the shoulder, the way a man throws who means it, who has thrown it before, who is not waving anyone off but is going to hit the small, old, bareheaded man in the face with everything he has. I have told you I had 4 seconds. I had used 3 of them. This is what I did with the 4th. I stepped between them. That is all. That is the whole of it, the act itself, and it sounds so small written down that I am almost ashamed to give it to you so plainly. I stepped off my post, 3 long strides across the gravel, and I put my body in the line between the big man's fist and the old man's face, and I caught the fist. I did not catch it with anger. I want to be clear about that, because everything that came after depended on it, and because a man who has worn this tunic learns early that anger is a kind of drink. It warms you and it makes you stupid. I caught the fist the way you catch a falling thing you do not want to break. With both hands, turning it, taking the force along its line instead of against it, so that the big man's own weight and his own rage carried him past me and down, off his balance, his shoulder rolling, his boots scrabbling on the gravel until he was bent and turned and held, his striking arm folded up behind him and my hand flat between his shoulder blades and my knee braced, and the whole roaring weight of him pinned and going nowhere, an arm's length from the face he had meant to ruin. He had not touched Corwin Vale, he never would. And I had not struck him. I want that on the record too, here, before any of the rest of it, because in the days that followed there would be a great deal of noise about what the King's Guard does and does not do, and a great many men who were not there would have opinions about whether I had been too gentle or too rough, and the simple truth that I will hold to until I am as old as the man I stood for is this: I did not hit him. Not once. Not then when he was throwing himself against my grip and spitting and calling me names I will not write down. Not after. The power of that morning, and there was power in it, more power than I have ever held in my two hands at once. The power of it was restraint. It was a thing held back. The whole strength of it lay in the strength I did not use. But I am getting ahead of myself, and a man telling a story that matters should not get ahead of himself, because then the listener cannot feel the weight of each thing as it lands. So let me go back. Let me tell you who I am, and where I was standing, and why an old man's bare head undid me, and how the 4 seconds in the forecourt of Harrogate Palace became, before the day was out, a thing the whole kingdom of Eldermoor would argue about and remember, and how the worst man I have ever laid hands on came, in the end, to be the one who taught me what that ribbon on the old soldier's chest had cost. My name is Sergeant Halden Bray, of the household foot of the royal house of Harrogate. I have stood the palace posts for 19 years. My father stood them before me for 31, and his father a span I never properly counted, so that there has been a Bray on the Harrogate gates for longer than there have been paved roads to reach them. We are not a great family. We are not a family at all, in the way the heralds mean it: no crest, no lands, no seat at any table. What we have is a habit. 3 generations of standing still in the cold for the house of Harrogate, and a private creed, handed down from my grandfather to my father to me, in almost the same words each time, which is that the uniform is not a thing you wear but a thing you carry, and that the carrying of it is the whole of the honor, and that any fool can hold a rifle but it takes a man to hold himself. I did not understand that creed for a long time. I thought, the way young men do, that the standing still was a kind of waiting, that the real soldiering would come later in some other place, some battle, some charge, and that the post was only the apprenticeship for it. It took me years to understand that the post is the thing itself. That standing still correctly, for the right reasons in front of the right stone, is not the apprenticeship for honor. It is honor. There is no later. There is only the post, and the way a man keeps it, and whether when the 4 seconds come, and they always come, once or twice in a life, they come. He is the kind of man who has spent his 19 years getting ready, or the kind who only thought he was. I have stood at coronations. I have stood the long night vigils in the chapel when a great one of the house lay in state, the candles guttering, the cold coming up through the stone into the soles of my boots until I could not feel my feet, and stood it without moving, because the dead deserve a watch that does not flinch. I have stood the gates when the mobs came in the bad winter 8 years gone, when the bread was short and the temper of the realm was shorter, and held the line with my fellows shoulder to shoulder, and not one stone thrown back, though God knows stones enough were thrown at us. I have carried the small Princess Malin on my shoulders through the orchard when she was 4 and the bees were out, and she was frightened of them, which is not in any manual of the household foot, and which I would do again tomorrow. I have done, in 19 years, a great many things in this uniform. But if you asked me, if you stood me at the foot of the memorial stone, and asked me to name the morning I was most a guardsman, the morning I most carried the thing my grandfather meant when he tied my father's chin strap the first time, and said the words, I would not name the coronation or the vigil or the winter of the stones. I would name the morning of the old soldier's bare head, the morning of the green-jacketed man and his thrown fist, the morning I did not hit a man I could have broken, and learned, in the not hitting, more about what I am than 19 years of standing still had ever taught me. So Harrogate Palace, the remembrance of the fallen, the gray edge of autumn, let me set it for you the way it was, the whole of it, so that you stand where I stood and feel the wind change. The forecourt is a long flat ground of pale gravel, walled on 3 sides, the south face of the palace itself behind us, a high old gray thing with windows like watchful eyes. the eastern wall lower, with its stone bench running the length of it where we had set the chairs, and the western colonnade, where the lords stand on the great days, under the carved arches. The fourth side is the public gate, the great iron gate with its gilded points, and beyond it the long approach road and the city. On Remembrance morning the gate stands open, which it does on no other day, and the people come up the approach in a slow, dark river and through the gate and across the forecourt to the memorial stone. The stone stands at the center, on its 3 steps, an old rough block of gray granite taller than a tall man, and on its 4 faces are carved the names. Not all the names, there are too many names. There have always been too many names. That is the whole grief of the thing. But the names of the fallen of each of the realm's great hours, the wars and the floods and the plagues and the long bitter winters gathered face by face, so that to walk around the stone is to walk through the worst centuries of the kingdom of Eldermoor. And the worst is always also, somehow, the best, because the names are there because men went out to meet the worst on the rest of our behalf. At the foot of the stone on the lowest step is where the rosemary goes. By noon on Remembrance morning the lowest step is buried in it, a drift of gray-green, and the whole forecourt smells of it, that clean, sharp smell, the smell of remembering. Queen Saralind comes herself every year, without fail, in the plainest mourning she owns, and lays the first sprig, and stands a while with her head bowed, and then withdraws to the western colonnade, and lets the realm have its grief without her in the middle of it. That is a wise woman and a good queen, and I have stood near enough to her on enough mornings to tell you that the bowing of her head is not for show. She lost an uncle young in the Eastern campaign, a man she barely remembered, and she has told the court more than once that she lays her sprig for him, and for every man who left a child who barely remembered him, and that there is no shortage of those, and never has been. That morning she had come and gone by the time the trouble started, laid her sprig at the first gray light, stood her while withdrawn. The prince consort Aldrich had stood with her, grave in his dark coat, and the 2 royal children, the Princess Malin who is 8 and the Prince Joran who is 10, had stood between them, scrubbed and solemn and trying very hard, the way children do at a thing they sense is large and do not fully understand, to be as still as the grown people around them. Little Malin had laid her own sprig. She had to climb the bottom step to reach the drift of it, and she had looked up at the stone, up and up, at all the names she could not yet read, and then she had looked across the forecourt at the line of old men by the eastern wall, and I had watched her do it, and I had thought, she is trying to understand that the names were men, that they sat in chairs, that they took off their caps. She is 8, and she is doing the arithmetic of the stone, and it is breaking her small heart a little, and that is exactly as it should be, because that arithmetic should break a heart a little, and a realm whose children do not do it is a realm that has forgotten what the stone is for. Then the royal party had withdrawn, and the day became the people's day, and the slow dark river came up the approach road and through the gate, and I stood my post at the inner cordon and watched. I had drawn the inner cordon by the luck of the roster, which I have since decided was not luck at all, but I am not a man given to that kind of talk, so I will only say I drew it. The inner cordon is the rope and stanchion line that keeps the public a respectful few strides back from the stone itself, and from the line of veterans along the eastern wall, so that the old men can have their mourning without 1,000 strangers pressing on them. It is the post nearest the veterans. It is the post from which, if a man is watching, he can see their faces, and I am a man who watches. We had 14 of the old soldiers that year. I had counted them as they came in. 14, which was 3 fewer than the year before, and the year before that it had been 22, and the year before that 30-odd, and I had been counting them long enough to know what the falling number meant, and to feel it in my chest each autumn like a stone settling. They are going. The men who carry the realm's hardest memory in their own bodies are going, 1 and 2 at a time, and there is no replacing them, and one remembrance morning. Not soon, please God, but not so very far off either. There will be no chairs needed along the eastern wall at all, and the stone will have to remember entirely by itself, and we who are left will have to remember harder to make up for it. So I watched the 14, and of the 14, as I have said, my eye kept going back to the smallest and the straightest, the bareheaded one at the head of the line, the one I did not yet know was named Corwin Vale. I have given you the 4 seconds, and I have given you the catch, and now you know the ground we stood on. Let me take you back into the moment, because the moment did not end when I had the big man pinned. That is the mistake everyone makes who has never held a violent man down with his own 2 hands. They think the holding is the hard part, the dramatic part, and that once he is down it is over. It is not over. It has barely begun. A man who is down and pinned and full of rage is more dangerous to the people around him than a man on his feet, because he has nothing left to lose and nothing to do with his fury but throw it at the only thing in reach, which is you, with his voice, and at everyone watching with the spectacle of it. So there I was, down on one knee in the gravel of the forecourt, with the big man bent and folded under my hands, his arm up behind his back at the exact angle past which it would have begun to do him harm, and not 1 degree further, my knee in the small of his back, my full weight settled and patient. And around us silence. Not the silence I am used to, the disciplined silence of the post. A held silence. 1,000 people who had pulled breath at once and not yet let it out, and the 14 old men risen as far as they could rise, and the footman frozen with his tray, and somewhere up in the western colonnade a stir of dark coats as the household men who had stood with the Queen turned at the noise, and over it all, the sharp clean smell of the rosemary, drifting. And in front of me, an arm's length away, the smallest and the straightest of the old men, Corwin Vale, still standing, still bareheaded, his cap still held in both hands against his chest. He had not moved. In all the screech and the lurch and the catch and the going down, in the whole violent half-second of it, the old soldier had not taken 1 step back. He stood at the head of the line of chairs with his cap to his chest, and he looked down at the big man folded under my hands, and then he looked up at me, and our eyes met for the first time, and I will tell you what was in his. It was not gratitude. I had expected gratitude in the part of my mind that was still capable of expecting anything, and there was none. It was not fear, which was gone now, or had never been there. It was a kind of grave assessment. He looked at me the way one old soldier looks at a young one who has just done a thing correctly, measuring it, weighing it, deciding whether it had been done from the right place. And then very slightly, so slightly that I think I was the only one in the whole forecourt who saw it, Corwin Vale inclined his head. Not a bow, a nod. The nod a man gives across a gulf of years to another man who has just shown him that the thing he gave his own life to is still alive in someone younger. That nod is the reason I am telling you this story. I have stood at coronations and been thanked by a queen, and I am telling you that the nod of that bareheaded old man, given across an arm's length of gravel with a violent stranger folded between us, is worth more to me than all of it, and that I have spent the years since trying to be worthy of it, and that I am not sure I have managed, and that the trying is the whole of what I have to show for my life, and that it is enough. Then the big man under my hands found his voice, and the morning turned again. "Get off me," he said into the gravel. And then louder, twisting, "Get off me, you tin toy, you ornament, you're not even a real. I will spare you the rest of it." There was a great deal of it in the minutes that followed, and most of it was the kind of thing a drunk and frightened man says when he has thrown his whole weight at a thing and found it would not move, and I had heard most of it before, in other forecourts from other men, and it has long since stopped having any power to wound me. But I want you to hear the first of it, the tin toy and the ornament and the not even real, because it is the seed of the whole thing that grew up around that morning afterward. That is what he saw when he came over the rope. He did not see a man. He saw a costume. He saw an ornament, a thing put there for show, a tin toy that would stand and let him do what he liked because tin toys do not fight back. The whole of his certainty, the certainty that let him throw a fist at an 81-year-old man in front of 1,000 witnesses, rested on the belief that the figure between him and his prey was not real. He was about to learn how wrong he was, and so, in a different way, was I. The first of my fellows reached me within the span of a few heartbeats, though it felt longer, the way such spans always do. It was Corporal Edrin Mauve, who had the post at the western end of the cordon, and who is the fastest man in the household foot over a short distance, a fact he is insufferable about on ordinary days, and which I forgave him entirely that morning. He came across the gravel at a dead run with his hand up, palm out, not to the big man but to the crowd, slow, stay back, because Edrin understood as I understood, that the greatest danger now was not the one man under my hands but the 1,000 people behind the rope who were one wrong noise away from a stampede. A crowd that has held its breath will, when it lets it out, sometimes let it out as a scream and a surge against that iron gate, with old men and small children in the press, would have killed people that the big man on his own never could have. So Edrin's first act was not to seize the man but to calm the crowd, and I have never been prouder of a younger guardsman, because that is the hard discipline, that is the thing they do not teach you, that is the choosing of the larger duty over the nearer one. He put himself between the spectacle and the people, hand up, voice low and level and carrying, "It is all right, it is held, it is over, all is well," and you could feel the crowd's held breath go out of it not as a scream but as a long ragged sigh, and the danger of the surge passed. Behind Edrin came two more, Lyle Fenwick and a young one, barely a year sworn, named O's Tunney, and between the three of them the practical business was done quietly and well. We have a way of taking up a violent man, the household foot, that does not require striking him and does not put him at risk and does not make a show. One man to each arm, the wrists turned in, the elbows controlled, the whole weight shared so that no single joint takes a strain, and the man lifted to his feet already held, already going where you want him to go, before he has understood he is moving. We did it that way. I came off his back as Fenwick and Tunney took his arms, and he came up between them roaring and writhing, and he found there was nowhere for the roaring and the writhing to go, that he was held at 4 points and going backward toward the eastern guardroom door whether he liked it or not, and the more he fought the more gently and inexorably the 4 points carried him, until even he could feel the absurdity of it, the way a strong man feels absurd fighting the tide. "You're hurting me," he said, which was a lie, and he knew it was a lie, and he said it loudly so the crowd would hear, and that too is a thing such men do. "No," I said, "we are not." It was the first word I had spoken. I had not spoken in the 4 seconds or the catch or the holding. There had been nothing to say. But now there was something to say, because the crowd was listening and the man was lying, and a lie left standing in front of 1,000 frightened people becomes a kind of truth, and I would not have it. "No one is hurting you," I said, level and clear, pitched not at him but at the listening forecourt. "You are being held because you came over the cordon and raised your hand to an old man in front of the realm on the morning we remember its dead. You will be held until the magistrate's men come for you. No one has struck you, and no one will. You have not been harmed, and you will not be, and the only reason for any discomfort you feel is that you will not stop fighting men who are trying to carry you gently. Be still, and even that will stop." I do not know where the words came from. I am not, by nature, a man who makes speeches, but they came in that level pitch I had learned from my father, who learned it from his, and they did a thing I had not fully expected, which was that they reached the crowd before they reached the man. I felt it happen. I felt the 1,000 people behind the rope take the measure of the 2 figures in the gravel, the roaring man who claimed to be hurt, and the still one in the red tunic who said, plainly, that he was not and would not be, and I felt them decide which one was telling the truth. You can feel a crowd decide. It is the closest thing to a living single creature that a guardsman ever stands in front of. And the crowd decided in that moment for me, and the deciding was the first turn of the whole long day, and I did not yet understand how much would turn on it. Because the mourning of the bareheaded old man was not going to stay in the forecourt. It was going to go out, that very hour, into the whole kingdom of Eldermoor, into the markets and the guild halls and the broadsheets and the long arguments in the taverns at night. And the only thing that would stand between the truth of it and the lie of it was whether the people who were there, in the gravel, in the rosemary smell, had decided which of the two men in front of them was the real one. They had decided. Now I had to be worthy of the deciding. The big man's name was Brannock Skell. I learned it from the magistrate's warden who came for him, a heavy patient man named Goodall who had worked the city's worst quarters for 30 years, and who knew Skell by sight the moment he came puffing across the forecourt with his 2 constables. Brannock Skell, Goodall said, not to me, almost to himself, the way you say the name of a recurring weather. Of course it is, of course it's you. And then to me with a kind of weary respect, you held him without marking him, Sergeant, in front of all this. He gestured at the 1,000 witnesses, the open gate, the broadsheet men I had not even noticed but who were of course there, scribbling. That's well done. That's better than well done. You've no idea the trouble you've saved everyone. I did not understand then what he meant by trouble saved. I understood it later. But at the time I only said that I had done my post, which is the answer my father would have given, and Goodall looked at me a moment longer with that weary respect, and then he and his constables took up Brannock Skell from my fellows, and Skell went with them, still cursing, but quieter now, the fight gone out of him the way it goes out of such men once the audience has decided against them, and the warden's hands are on him. But here is the thing about Brannock Skell that I want you to hold on to, because it matters later, and because it is the first of the morning's complications. He was not alone. I had taken him for a lone drunk, a man who had wandered up the approach road with a grievance and a skinful and found the worst possible place to discharge them. That is what he looked like coming over the rope. But as Goodall's men walked him out through the great gate, I saw, in the press of the crowd, 3 other men turn and go with him, not arrested, not held. Walking free on the public side of the rope, but plainly with him, 3 hard-faced young men in the same thin green jackets, who had been standing in the crowd the whole time, who had watched Skell come over the rope and throw his fist and go down under my hands and had not lifted a finger to help him or to stop him, but who now fell in around the warden's little procession at a distance, watching, their faces closed. I marked them. A guardsman marks such things without deciding to. 3 men in matching jackets, keeping pace with the arrested man, saying nothing, watching everything. It meant that Brannock Skell was not a lone drunk with a grievance. It meant he had come up the approach road with company, and that the company had let him do what he did, and that whatever had brought him over that rope at an 81-year-old veteran was a thing with more behind it than a skinful of drink. I did not know what. I would not know for some days, but I marked the 3 green jackets going out the gate, and I filed them away, and I turned back to the more important thing, which was the old man at the head of the line of chairs, who had not, in all of it, sat down. Corwin Vale was looking at me. I crossed the gravel to him, properly, now, not at a run, the post handed off to Edrin behind me, the morning beginning its slow return to what it had been. The 14 old men had settled, more or less, into a stunned and murmuring knot, and the footman had recovered enough to be moving among them with his tray, and the crowd beyond the rope had begun, in the way of crowds, to break back into 1,000 separate people again, the single creature dissolving. But Corwin Vale stood apart from his fellows, at the head of the line, exactly where he had stood through all of it, with his cap still in both hands against his chest, and he watched me come. Up close he was even smaller than he had looked from the cordon, and even straighter. His face was a map of his 81 years, deep-lined, weather-burned, the skin gone fine and papery over the bones, but his eyes were not an old man's eyes. They were gray and level and entirely present, and they took the measure of me as I came, the way they had taken it across the gravel, and I found to my surprise that I was nervous. 19 years of standing in front of queens, and I was nervous in front of a 9-stone old man in a too large coat. I think it was because I sensed, even then, that he was going to say something to me, and that whatever he said was going to matter, and that I wanted very badly to deserve it. "You stepped off your post," Corwin Vale said. It was not what I had expected. I had expected thanks, or perhaps the formal kind of thing the old soldiers say. I had not expected to be reminded in a clear, unhurried voice that I had broken the first rule of the household foot, which is that you do not leave your post, not for anything, not for anyone, that the post is the post, and you hold it though the sky fall. "I did, sir," I said. "You know what that costs a man in your service. You'll have it said to you. There'll be those who say you should have shouted, called for the men down the line, held your ground and let it play out." His gray eyes did not leave mine. "There's a kind of officer who'll tell you the post matters more than the one old fool who came to stand at the stone." "There may be, sir," I said. "And what will you tell him?" I thought about it. He had asked it plainly, and he deserved a plain answer, and I found I had one, though I had not known I had it until that moment, which is the way of the truest things a man believes. "I'll tell him," I said, "that the post is for the stone, and the stone is for the men whose names are on it, and you are a man whose name would have gone on it, sir, if a different morning had gone differently 50 years ago. So I did not leave the post. I took it with me. The post was wherever you were standing." Corwin Vale looked at me for a long moment, and then the second thing happened that I will carry to my grave. The old soldier's eyes filled, not over. He was not a man who would let them go over, but filled, brightened, the gray of them gone bright and swimming. And he reached out one papery hand and took my gloved one, not to shake it, but to hold it, the way you hold something, and he said, very quietly, so that only I could hear, "My son would have been about your age." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which was right, because there are things a man says to which any answer is too small. I only held his hand and let him hold mine, 2 men in the rosemary smell, the morning settling around us, and after a while he let go and stepped back and put himself straight again, and the moment closed, and he became once more the smallest and the straightest of the old men. But the door it had opened did not close, and over the days that followed I came to know Corwin Vale, and to know the story of the dark ribbon, and I will tell it to you now, because you cannot understand the rest of what happened, the trial, and the great public argument, and the thing Brannock Skell did at the end that I never could have foreseen, unless you understand the man whose bare head began it all. I learned it from him, over those days in pieces, the way old men give such things sideways when they are looking at something else. And I learned the rest of it from the records, because a guardsman has access to the records, and because once I had begun I could not stop until I knew the whole of it. Corwin Vale had gone to the Eastern Campaign as a boy of 19, my age when I first stood the gates, near enough, in the worst of the realm's wars, the long brutal years on the Eastern marches that the histories call the Marsh War, because most of the dying was done in the marshes, in the cold black water in the reeds, against an enemy who knew the ground and a winter that did not care which side a man was on. It was the war that filled the eastern face of the memorial stone. There are more names on that face than on the other 3 together. Corwin Vale's name is not on it, but it came within an hour of being on it, and it would have been except for the thing he did, which is the thing the dark ribbon is for. I will not give you the whole of the battle, because Corwin Vale never gave me the whole of it, and I will not pretend to a knowledge I did not earn. But the shape of it is this. His company was cut off in the marsh, in the last winter of the war, on the wrong side of a flooded ford, with the water rising and the enemy closing, and the order to hold a crossing that everyone, the enemy, the company, the boy Corwin Vale, understood could not be held. 40 men. A crossing the whole Eastern army needed held for one night, so that the wounded and the baggage and the women and children who follow every army could get clear up the only road. One night. 40 men against a thing no 40 men could stop. They held it. They held the crossing the whole night, in the black water, and when the dawn came the road was clear and the wounded were away, and the women and children were safe up the eastern road. And of the 40 men who had gone into the ford at dusk, 6 came out at dawn, and one of the 6 was Corwin Vale, who had 19 years and a wound in his side he would carry the other 62, and who had at some hour of that black night, when the line broke and the enemy came through the gap, gone back into the water alone to drag out the men who could still be dragged, 1 and 2 at a time, under fire in the cold, until he had pulled 4 living men out of the marsh and onto the road, and then gone back a 5th time for a man he could hear calling, and not found him, and very nearly not come back himself. The dark ribbon is the realm's highest honor. It is given for one thing only, for a man who spends himself utterly, beyond any order, beyond any sense, for other men, at the certain cost of his own life and lives. There are 11 living men in the whole kingdom of Eldermoor who wear the dark ribbon. I had stood beside a queen for 19 years, and I had never, until that morning, stood beside one of the 11. And the 11th, the smallest and the straightest of them, had come to the remembrance of the fallen on the gray edge of autumn to stand bareheaded at the stone, because, and here is the thing, here is the whole heart of the man, because the 5th man, the one he could hear calling and went back for and did not find, was on the stone. His name was on the eastern face, and Corwin Vale had come, every remembrance morning for 62 years, to stand bareheaded in front of that name, the name of the man he had not been able to save, and to hold his cap against his chest the way you hold something you are giving back, and to say to that name, in whatever words a man says such things, that he was sorry and that he had tried, and that he remembered. That is who Brannock Skell threw his fist at. That is the bareheaded little old man, a drunk in a green jacket came over the rope to strike, in front of the realm, on Remembrance morning. A man who had spent a whole black night spending himself for strangers, and 62 years grieving the one he could not reach. And the sun. I have to tell you about the sun, because the sun is why the old man's eyes filled when I said the post was wherever he was standing. Corwin Vale married after the war a marsh country woman, and they had one child, a boy born late when Corwin was already past 40, a boy he named for the man on the stone he had not been able to save. And the boy grew up, and against his father's wishes, for Corwin Vale of all men knew what war costs and did not want it for his son, the boy went for a soldier too. And the boy did not come home. There was no great battle, no dark ribbon, no held crossing. There was a border skirmish in a season nobody remembers, a small ugly nothing of a fight in a place not worth the name it had, and the boy was killed in it at 26, doing his duty, well and quietly, the way his father had taught him, and his name is not on the memorial stone because the stone is only for the realm's great hours, and a border skirmish is not a great hour. It is only a great grief, to the one father it belongs to. So Corwin Vale came to the stone twice over, for the man on the eastern face he could not save, and for the son who is on no stone at all, who has no face of granite to be remembered by, whose only memorial is an old man standing bareheaded in the cold with his cap against his chest, doing the arithmetic of grief that the little Princess Malin had been doing in her small way an hour before, that the names were men, that they sat in chairs, that they took off their caps. My son would have been about your age, he had said. And I had stepped off my post for him without thinking, and taken the post with me and stood in the line of the fist, and I have come to think, that some part of me had known in the 4 seconds that I was standing in for a boy who never came home, and that the old man in the swimming of his gray eyes had known it too. I have given you the heart of the old man. Now I have to give you the harder thing, the thing I did not understand until the morning of the bareheaded head was 3 days gone, the thing that turned a single ugly moment in a forecourt into a matter that reached all the way up to the throne and all the way down into the worst quarters of the city. I have to tell you why Brannock Skell came over that rope, because he did not come at random. He did not stagger up the approach road and pick an old man out of a line by chance. He came for Corwin Vale. He came for that man on that morning on purpose, and the 3 green jackets who walked out behind the warden's men were the proof of it, and the unraveling of why is the spine of everything that followed. It began, as these things so often do, with money, and with a man who had a great deal of it and wanted more. The 3 green jackets and Brannock Skell were the men of one Hessian Roke. I had never heard the name, on the morning of the forecourt. Within the week I would know it better than I wished to. Hessian Roke was a builder, a great builder, a man who had risen in 20 years from a journeyman mason to the owner of half the quarries and a third of the brickworks in the southern reach, and who had built, with his quarries and his brickworks and his hard-faced young men in green jackets, a fortune and a kind of power that does not appear in any roll of the realm's lords but is felt, in the southern reach, in every contract signed and every rival ruined and every magistrate who finds, when a case touches Hessian Roke, that the evidence has become strangely thin. And Hessian Roke had wanted, for some years, a particular piece of ground in the southern reach. A piece of marsh country ground, drained and good, on the eastern road, the road, I came to understand with a slow cold turning in my chest, the road the wounded had gone up that black night 62 years before, the road Corwin Vale's crossing had held. The road was being widened, by the Crown's order, into a great new highway to the eastern marches, and the ground along it had become worth a fortune to a man who could get title to it before the highway was built. Hessian Roke meant to get that title. He had gotten most of it by the means such men use, but one stubborn old freeholder would not sell, would not be frightened, would not be bought, and held in his single stubborn hand the one piece of ground the highway most needed and Hessian Roke most wanted. The old freeholder was Corwin Vale. It was his ground, the marsh country ground his marsh country wife had brought him, where he had buried her, where his son had been born, the ground that touched the eastern road his own 19-year-old hands had held one black winter night so that the realm's wounded could go up it to safety. Of course he would not sell. He would no more have sold that ground than he would have sold the dark ribbon off his chest. And Hessian Roke, who had broken every other freeholder in the southern reach, found that the one he could not break was an 81-year-old veteran with a war hero's name, and a war hero's stubbornness, and nothing left to lose, because everyone he had ever loved was already in the ground he would not sell. You cannot frighten a man like that with the ordinary threats. He is past them. But Hessian Roke was a clever man in the way that the worst men are clever, and he understood that there is one thing even a man with nothing left to lose can still lose, and that is his standing, his honor, his name, the regard in which the realm holds him. And so Hessian Roke had begun, in the months before that Remembrance morning, a quiet campaign against the standing of Corwin Vale. He had paid men to whisper in the taverns of the southern reach that the old hero was not what he seemed, that the dark ribbon had been a mistake, or a lie, or bought, that the held crossing was a tale grown in the telling, that Corwin Vale was a bitter, greedy old man holding the realm's great highway hostage out of spite, standing in the way of progress and prosperity and the good of the whole eastern reach, for nothing but his own stubborn pride. And that, I came to understand, was why Brannock Skell came over the rope. Hessian Roke had not, I am sure, ordered Skell to strike the old man. Men like Roke do not give such orders. That is the whole of their cleverness. But he had filled Skell and the others with the whisper, the bitter, greedy old fraud standing in the way of honest men's bread, and he had pointed them, on Remembrance morning, at the place where the fraud would be standing, and he had let the drink and the grievance and the green jacket loyalty do the rest, and if it had gone as he meant it to, the realm would have read in the broadsheets the next morning not that a hero had been honored, but that an old man's stubbornness had finally goaded an honest working man past bearing, that even the patient men of the southern reach could be pushed too far by Corwin Vale, and the campaign against the old man's standing would have taken a great leap forward, and the ground, in the end, would have fallen to Hessian Roke. That was the game. and the game changed entirely the moment I stepped off my post. Because the broadsheets the next morning did not read the way Hessian Roke had meant them to. They read, instead, in headlines a hand high across the front of every sheet in the realm. A hero struck at the guard who would not let it fall. I did not see it coming, the public storm. A guardsman is the last man in the realm to understand what the realm is saying about him, because he is standing his post while it says it, and because he has been trained from boyhood not to listen, and because, in any case, the storm was not really about me. It was about the old man, and the stone, and a question the whole kingdom of Eldermoor had not known it needed to ask until it saw, in print, a hero struck at, and a guard who would not let it fall, which was the question of what a realm owes to the men who spent themselves for it, and whether it was keeping the debt, and whether, in the rush of new highways and quarries and the good of the eastern reach, it had begun, quietly, to let the old debts fall. It turned out the realm cared about that question very much. It began with the broadsheet men who had been there in the forecourt and who had seen the whole of it, the old man bareheaded at the stone, the fist thrown, the guard stepping in, the holding without a blow, the words I had said about no one being harmed. They wrote it the way they had seen it, which was the truth, and the truth, set down plainly, was a thing the realm could not put down once it had picked it up. Within a day there was not a tavern or a guild hall or a market in the city where men were not arguing about the mourning of the bareheaded head. Within 2 days the argument had reached the country towns. Within 3 it had reached the southern reach itself, the very ground where Hessian Roke had so carefully laid his whispers, and the whispers the bitter, greedy old fraud sounded, suddenly, very thin and very ugly against the headline a hand high. A hero struck at, and against the thing that everyone now knew, which was that the man who had been struck at wore the dark ribbon, and that there were only 11 men in the whole realm who did, and that one of them had been attacked at the foot of the memorial stone on the morning the realm remembers its dead. The realm was angry, not the loud, thin anger of the taverns which passes. A deeper, slower, more dangerous anger, the anger of a people who have been shown, plainly, that one of the best of them was nearly harmed, and that the harm was no accident, and that there was a clever rich man somewhere behind it. The realm wanted, in that low, dangerous way, to know who. And the broadsheet men, who are not fools, had begun to ask the same question, and to follow the 3 green jackets back from the forecourt, and to ask who Brannock Skell worked for, and whose ground the old hero would not sell, and why. And so, within a week of the morning I had thought was over the moment Goodall's men walked Skell out the gate, the thing had grown into something I could not have imagined kneeling in the gravel. A realm-wide reckoning, with an old man's stubborn ground at the center of it, and a rich man's name beginning slowly to surface in the muck, and the whole of it resting, the broadsheet men said, and the tavern said, and even, I was told, the court said, on the 4 seconds of a single guardsman who had stepped off his post. I will tell you honestly that it frightened me more than the fist had. The fist I had understood. The fist was a thing a guardsman is made for. But this, the headlines, the arguments, the weight of a realm's anger gathering behind a thing I had done in 4 seconds without thinking. This was a country I had no map for, and I did not trust it, and I was right not to trust it, because a realm's anger is a tide, and a tide can lift a thing up and a tide can smash it down, and the same broadsheet that had made me, in a week, into the guard who would not let it fall could unmake me just as fast if the tide turned, and there were men. Hessian Roke chief among them, who had every reason to turn it. The first sign that the tide could turn came from inside the palace, and it came, as the worst things in a great house always do, in the shape of a reasonable man being reasonable. His name was Lord Maddox Frail, and he was the controller of the household, the man who, beneath the Queen, runs the practical business of the palace, the rosters and the monies and the discipline of the servants, and when it touches such things, the household foot. He was not a cruel man. I want to be fair to him, because it would be easy not to be. He was a careful man, a man who had spent his life keeping a great house running smoothly, and to a man like that the smooth running of the house is the highest good, and anything that disturbs it, a guardsman in every broadsheet, a realm-wide argument breaking out around a single post, the name of the household in the mouth of every tavern in the city is not a triumph but a problem, and a problem must be managed, and the management of it to Lord Crail was very simple. He sent for me on the 8th day, and in his quiet paneled room, with the careful courtesy of a man who believes he is being kind, the controller of the household explained to me, reasonably, why I had done wrong. "You acted, Sergeant, on instinct," he said, "and instinct is a fine thing in a soldier, and I do not doubt for a moment that your instinct was a generous one. No one questions your courage. No one questions your heart. He had a way of granting you things he meant to take back. But you left your post. You understand that you left your post. The first rule of your service, the rule your own father kept for 30 years, you broke it. And you broke it in front of the entire realm. And now the entire realm is using a guardsman who broke the first rule of his service as a banner in a quarrel that has nothing to do with the household and everything to do with land and money in the southern reach. And the name of this house is being dragged through every tavern in the city. And that, Sergeant, whatever your heart, is a thing I cannot allow to stand." I said nothing. I had learned long ago that when a careful man is building toward a thing, you let him build, because the shape of what he wants comes clearer the longer he talks. "So here is what I propose," Lord Crail said, and folded his hands. "A statement. A simple, honest statement in your own name that you acted hastily, that in the heat of the moment you exceeded your post, that you regret the disturbance it has caused, that the household does not take sides in private quarrels among the realm's subjects, and that the matter of the old man's ground in the southern reach is a matter for the courts and not for the crown's guards. That is all. A few honest lines. It costs you nothing, you keep your post, your rank, your good name within these walls, all of it. And it lets the air out of this, Sergeant. It lets the realm's anger find some other thing to chew on, which it will within the week, and it gets the name of this house out of the mouth of every—" "No," I said. I did not raise my voice. I have my father's level pitch, and I used it, the same pitch I had used in the forecourt, and it landed in that quiet paneled room exactly as it had landed in the gravel, which is to say, it stopped the careful man mid-word. "My lord," I said, "I will not say that I acted hastily, because I did not. I will not say I exceeded my post, because I did not exceed it. I took it with me. And I will not say that the household takes no side, because, my lord, with respect, the household has already taken a side. It took the side of the realm's dead 1,000 years ago, and it takes it again every remembrance morning when the queen herself bows her head at the stone. And a man who wears the dark ribbon is the side of the realm's dead made flesh and walking among us. And I will not stand up in front of the realm and pretend that the House of Harrogate is neutral about whether a man who spent a whole black night spending himself for strangers may be struck in the face at the foot of the stone. We are not neutral about that. We must not be. If we are neutral about that, my lord, then I do not know what the post is for, and I do not know what the stone is for, and I do not know what I have stood 19 years in the cold to carry." There was a silence in the paneled room. I want to be honest about what that silence cost me, because the false comfort Lord Crail had held out was a real comfort, and I had felt the pull of it, the way you feel the pull of warm water when you are cold to the bone. A few honest lines. Keep your post, your rank, your good name. Let the air out of it. And no one, this was the cleverest part, and I do not think Lord Crail even knew it was clever, I think he believed it, no one would have blamed me. The realm would have understood. A guardsman regrets exceeding his post, of course he does, that is only proper. Corwin Vale himself, I think, would have understood. It would have cost me nothing that any reasonable man could see. It would only have cost me the thing my grandfather meant when he tied my father's chin-strap and said the words. It would only have cost me the nod the old soldier gave me across the gravel. It would only have cost me the 4 seconds, would have reached back into them and made them a mistake, a haste, a thing regretted, instead of the truest thing I ever did. That is what the reasonable middle costs, always. It costs you the thing that does not show up in any ledger, the thing you cannot point to, the thing that is only the difference between a man who carried the uniform and a man who merely wore it. And standing in that quiet room I understood, finally and entirely, the whole of my grandfather's creed, which I had been reciting for 19 years without fully knowing it. That the uniform is not a thing you wear but a thing you carry, and that the carrying is the whole of the honor, and that there are mornings when keeping the uniform clean in the eyes of careful men means setting down the thing it was made to carry, and that on those mornings you do not keep the uniform clean. You carry the thing. Whatever it costs. You understand, Lord Crail said at last, very quietly, and there was no anger in it, only a kind of weariness, that I cannot protect you if you will not let me, that the tide you are standing in front of is larger than you know, that there are men with a great deal to lose in this, men with quarries and brickworks and magistrates in their pockets, and that when such men cannot turn a thing aside they break it, and that the thing nearest to hand for them to break, Sergeant, is you, a guardsman who left his post. It is the easiest thing in the world to break. I am offering you the only shelter there is. I know it, my lord, I said, and I thank you for it truly because I know you mean it kindly. But I cannot take the shelter because the price of it is the old man's name, and the old man's name is not mine to spend. Lord Crail looked at me for a long while. And then he did a thing I did not expect, which was that he inclined his head, not the old soldier's nod, but something near it, and said, "Then God help you, Sergeant Bray, and God help the old man, because I think you are about to find out exactly how much weight a single right thing can be made to bear before it breaks." He was righter than he knew. Within 3 days Hessian Roque made his move. It came, as Lord Crail had warned me it would, in the shape of the law, for that was the cleverness of Hessian Roque, that he never broke a thing with his own hands, but always found a hand within the law to break it for him. Brannock Skell, in the magistrate's lockup awaiting his hearing, suddenly acquired a lawyer. Not a poor man's lawyer, not the kind a drunk in a green jacket could ever afford, but a fine sharp city advocate in a good black coat, who appeared one morning and posted Skell's bond, and walked him out of the lockup a free man pending trial, and who let it be known, that same afternoon, that his client Brannock Skell would be bringing a complaint of his own. The complaint was this, that on the morning of the Remembrance, Sergeant Halden Bray of the household foot had assaulted Brannock Skell, had laid violent hands upon a subject of the realm, had thrown him to the ground, had wrenched his arm near to breaking, and had done all this without lawful cause, for Skell, the complaint said, had been doing no more than gesturing in the heat of an argument when the guard, in a fit of overzealous brutality, attacked him before he had struck any blow at all. You will see the shape of it. It was a lie, of course. There were 1,000 witnesses to the lie of it, but it was a clever lie because it took the one true thing about that morning, the thing I was proudest of, and turned it into the weapon against me. I had not let Skell land his blow. That was the truth. I had stepped in before the fist reached the old man, and a clever advocate could stand up in a court and say, before the fist reached the old man, yes, before any blow was struck at all, so that the guard struck first, the guard was the aggressor. The guard laid violent hands on a man who had, in the eyes of the law, harmed no one yet. The very swiftness that had saved Corwin Vale's face was to be made the proof that I had assaulted an innocent man. And it was worse than that, because Hessian Roque's advocate did not stop at the false complaint. He did the thing that careful evil always does. He made the lie part of a larger, more reasonable-sounding story. He let it be put about, in the broadsheets that would take his coin, that the whole business had been overblown, that a tired old man had wandered too near a hot-tempered working-man, that words had been exchanged, that a guard, inflamed by the crowd and the occasion, had overreacted and brutalized a subject of the realm, and that the broadsheets, in their hunger for a hero, had spun a sordid little scuffle into a tale of struck heroes and noble guards, when the plain truth was a soldier who had hurt a man without cause and a press that had covered for him. Look, the advocate's broadsheet said, at the guard who left his post. Look at the man who broke the first rule of his own service. Is that the kind of man whose word you would take over an honest working man's? A man who could not even keep the one rule he was sworn to keep. I felt the tide turn. Lord Crail had warned me of it, and now I felt it in the space of a few days, the great slow tide of the realm's regard beginning here and there to slacken and to swing. Not everyone, most held. But a thing had been introduced into the realm's mind, a small ugly worm of a doubt. Perhaps it was overblown, perhaps the guard did go too far. Perhaps the old man's hands are not so clean either. What is he really, holding up the great highway, a hero or a stubborn old miser? And the worm, once introduced, began to do its work. And I understood for the first time the true scale of what Hessian Roque was, which was not a man who could be beaten by being in the right. He could lose every fact and still win, if he could only make the realm tired enough, and doubtful enough, and confused enough, that it stopped caring which of us was the honest one. That was the darkest stretch. I will not pretend it was not. There were nights, in those weeks before the trial, when I sat alone in the small stone room that has been the lodging of the senior sergeant of the household foot for longer than there have been paved roads, and I turned my father's old chinstrap over in my hands. I keep it, the worn leather thing, the one my grandfather tied the first time, and I wondered whether the level pitch I had used on Lord Crail had been pride dressed up as honor. Whether I had spent the old man's name and my own, and the good name of the house for nothing but the warm feeling of having refused the reasonable thing. Whether Crail had been right, and the right thing was about to be made to bear more weight than it could carry and break, and take the old man down with it, and leave Hessian Roque richer, and the Eastern Road his, and the dark ribbon's bearer dragged through the muck in his last years for the crime of having held a crossing one black winter night before any of us were born. It was Corwin Vale who took me out of that stretch. Of course it was. I had stepped between him and the fist. It was only right that he should step between me and the worst thing, the despair, which is a fist a man throws at himself. He came to the palace. He had no business at the palace, an old freeholder from the southern reach, and he was 81 and the journey was hard on him, but he came, and he sent his name in to me. I have it still, the little paper, Corwin Vale, asking the favor of a word with Sergeant Bray, and I went down to the gate and brought him in, and we sat in the small stone room, the old soldier and I made him tea on the little iron stove the way my father had taught me, and we talked. "You're carrying it wrong," he said to me after a while, looking at the chinstrap in my hands. "I can see it on you. You're carrying it as though the question is whether you'll win. That's the wrong weight. Set that down." "How do I carry it then?" I asked him. I asked it as a younger soldier asks an older one, plainly, because he was the one man in the realm I would ask. "The same way you carried it in the forecourt," Corwin Vale said. "You didn't step between me and that man because you'd reckoned the odds and found you'd win. You couldn't have known you'd win. He was twice your size and full of drink. You stepped between because it was the thing to do, and you'd have stepped between if you'd known he would break you, because the breaking isn't the point. The point is the standing between. I learned that in the marsh, son, in the black water, going back the 5th time for a man I couldn't reach. I didn't go back because I thought I'd save him. I went back because going back was the thing, and not going back was a thing I could not live inside. The winning was never mine to decide, only the going back." He set down his tea and looked at me with his gray level eyes. "You did the going back," he said. "You did the standing between. That part is done, and it cannot be taken from you no matter what their courts decide, because it already happened and it was true. The rest, the trial, the tide, the rich man and his lies, the rest is not yours to win. It is only yours to face. So set down the weight of winning, son. Pick up the lighter thing. Pick up the facing. And let me tell you a secret about the facing, that I learned in 62 years of it. It is much lighter than you think, once you stop trying to win, and it is the only weight a man can carry all the way to the end without it breaking him. I have thought about those words every day since. I think about them now. And I will tell you that I set down the weight of winning that evening in the small stone room with the old soldier and the iron stove and the 2 cups of tea. And that when I picked up the lighter thing, the facing, the trial that had loomed like a cliff became, suddenly, only a thing that was going to happen, that I was going to walk into and tell the truth in and walk out of, whatever it decided, and that the very next morning with that lighter weight on me, I walked into the magistrate's court to give my testimony, and found Hessian himself waiting for me on the steps. I knew him at once, though I had never seen him. You always know the kind of man who has arranged for you to find him on the steps. He was not large, that surprised me. After the green-jacketed men he kept, but small and neat and very still, a man in a quiet, expensive gray coat, with gray hair brushed flat and a face that had learned over a long time to show exactly as much as it chose and not one flicker more. He stood at the top of the court steps, alone in a patch of thin morning sun, and he watched me come up, and when I reached the step below his he spoke, pleasantly, as if we were 2 men who happened to have met. "Sergeant Bray," he said, "I wanted to see you before this goes any further, man to man. I think there has been a great deal of foolishness on all sides, and I am a man who would rather solve a problem than feed it." "Mr. Roke," I said to let him know I knew him. Something moved very slightly behind the gray face, a recalculation, the small adjustment a clever man makes when a piece of his ground proves firmer than he expected. "You know me? Good. Then we needn't waste each other's morning pretending. Here is the plain shape of it, Sergeant. My man Skell behaved badly. I do not defend it, I have told him so. And you by all accounts behaved very well, too well perhaps, but a man can hardly be blamed for an excess of courage. The trouble is that the 2 of you between you have set fire to a thing that was nobody's intention, and the fire is doing a great deal of harm to your good name, which is being argued over in every tavern in the realm, to the old man, whom the broadsheets will tire of and turn on within the month as they always do, and to great public work, the Eastern Highway, that will be the saving of the whole southern reach and 1,000 poor families in it. A great deal of harm, Sergeant, over a moment's foolishness. And I am here, man to man, to offer to put the fire out." "And how would you do that, Mr. Roke?" I asked. I asked it level. I was, I found, genuinely curious, in the cold way a soldier is curious about the shape of the ground he is going to have to fight on. "Skell withdraws his complaint," Roke said. "Today, before you ever take the stand. He pleads to the lesser charge, takes his small punishment in the matter of the assault on you, which I know you do not want. You are not a man who wants a fellow subject ruined, simply ends. The broadsheets lose half their fire at a stroke. And the other half," he paused, delicately, "the other half, the matter of the old man and his ground, I would be willing to see settled, very generously, in the old man's favor. He keeps his ground. The highway finds another line, it is only money and I have money. Everyone goes home. The hero keeps his ground and his honor, you keep your good name, Skell keeps his neck, and the southern reach keeps its highway. I cannot imagine a man of sense refusing it. There is no loser in it but my pride, and I am old enough to spend my pride cheaply when the alternative is fire. I will tell you that it was, on its face, a good offer, a better offer than Lord Crail's. It gave the old man his ground, the very thing the whole fight was about. It gave me my name. It cost no one anything but Hessian Roke's pride and his money, both of which he said he could spare. A man of sense would take it. He had said so, and he had meant me to feel the truth of it, and I did feel it. And then I understood what it was. It was the same thing Lord Crail's offer had been, only larger and cleverer, and dressed in the old man's own interest so that refusing it would look like spite. It was the reasonable middle. It was the warm water. And the price of it, the price hidden underneath all that generosity, the price Hessian Roke was very carefully not naming, was the truth. If Skell withdrew the complaint and I never took the stand, then the lie would never be answered. It would simply be set down, unexamined, and over time it would settle into the realm's memory as a thing that was probably half true on both sides. A scuffle, a misunderstanding, a moment's foolishness, the very story Roke's broadsheets had been selling. The old man would keep his ground, yes, but the realm would never quite know that he had been hunted for it. Roke would keep his name. And the dark ribbon, and the held crossing, and the bareheaded head at the stone would all be quietly folded back into the realm's ordinary forgetting. And the man who had tried to break a hero for a strip of road would walk away clean, his pride and his money spent, but his name spotless, free to do it again to the next stubborn old freeholder in some other reach, where there happened to be no guard near the rope. No, I said. For the third time. I had said it to Lord Frail, and I said it now to Hessian Roke, and I would say it, I understood, as many times as the reasonable middle was offered to me, because that is what the level pitch is for, that is what 19 years in the cold are for, that is the whole of the going back the old man had taught me. No, Mr. Roke. I am going to go in there and I am going to tell the truth, the whole of it, what your man did and why he did it and who pointed him at the stone, and I am going to let the court make of it what it will. Not because I want Skell ruined, I don't, and not because I want your pride spent, because the truth of that morning is owed. It is owed to the old man, and it is owed to the man on the stone he could not save, and it is owed to a boy who died in a border skirmish nobody remembers, and it is owed to the realm which has a right to know what was done to one of its heroes and by whom. You cannot buy that debt off, Mr. Roke. It is not for sale. It was never for sale. That is the one thing men like you never understand about men like the old man, and it is the thing that is going to undo you. There are people in this realm who simply will not sell, and you have spent your whole life never once meeting one, and now you have met two in a single autumn, and we are both going to cost you everything. Hessian Roke looked at me for a long moment with his still gray face, and then he said, very quietly, in a voice that had dropped all its pleasantness and become the true voice underneath, flat and cold as a quarry floor. Then you are a fool, Sergeant, and so is the old man, and I will break you both, and I will be sorry to do it, the way a man is sorry to break a good tool that will not fit his hand. Go in, tell your truth. See how far the truth gets you in a room where I have already paid for the floor. And he stepped aside and let me pass, and I went up the steps and into the court, and I did not know it yet, but Hessian Roke had just made the one mistake that clever men make exactly once. He had told me, on the steps in his cold, true voice, that he had paid for the floor of the courtroom, and there had been a witness on the steps, and the witness was not me. But I will come to the witness. First the court, because the court is where the whole long autumn came to its head, and where the turn finally landed, and I want you to feel it land the way I felt it. The courtroom was an old high-paneled hall, and it was full. It was fuller than any courtroom in the Southern Reach had been in living memory, because the morning of the bareheaded head had become, by then, the realm's great argument, and the realm had come to see it decided, the broadsheet men crammed 3 deep along the back wall, the ordinary people packing the benches, a knot of the green jackets near the front, and on a bench by herself near the side, a small straight figure in a faded blue greatcoat. Corwin Vale had come. Of course he had come. He sat with his cap in his lap this time, for a man keeps his cap on indoors, but he held it the same way in both hands, the way you hold something you are giving back. And on the high seat in his black robe sat the magistrate. His name was Aldous Penhart, and I had heard the name in the days before, in the careful way men in the Southern Reach said names that touched Hessian Roke, and I understood, the moment I saw the magistrate's soft, heavy, untroubled face, exactly what Roke had meant on the steps when he said he had paid for the floor. Penhart was Roke's. The whole Reach knew it, and no one could prove it. Cases that touched Hessian Roke came before Magistrate Penhart, and the evidence went thin and the verdict went Roke's way, and the thing was done under the full color of the law, which is the deepest corruption there is, the corruption that wears the robe. So that was the room, the truth on one side, an old man, a guard, 1,000 witnesses to a thrown fist, and on the other, a clever advocate, a bought magistrate, a false complaint, and behind it all the still gray patient figure of Hessian Roque, who had taken his seat now in the front row and folded his hands and settled in to watch me be broken on a floor he had paid for. It went, at first, exactly as Roque had meant it to. The advocate stood, and he was good. I will not pretend he was not. He did not bluster. He told a quiet, reasonable story, and the story was a fog, and the fog was deadly. He granted everything that could not be denied. Yes, his client had behaved foolishly. Yes, there had been a disturbance at the Remembrance. Yes, words had been heat exchanged. And then, gently, he began to lay his fog over the rest. Was it not true, he asked the court, that Sergeant Bray had left his post, broken the first and most sacred rule of his own service? It was true. I had said so myself. Was it not true that Sergeant Bray had laid hands on his client before any blow was struck, that by the guard's own account the guard had moved first? It was true. Was it not true that the elderly complainant in this affair, this much-praised old soldier, was in fact a freeholder embroiled in a bitter and long-standing dispute over valuable land? A dispute in which he, the supposed innocent, stood to gain a fortune by obstructing a public highway. It was true, in the bare bones of it, true enough that a clever man could build a fog on it. And so by the time the advocate sat down, he had made the room breathe a question it had not walked in with. Perhaps this was not a hero and a villain at all. Perhaps it was two stubborn parties to a money quarrel and an overzealous guard, and perhaps the whole noble tale was a thing the broadsheets had spun, and perhaps the just thing, the reasonable, sensible, grown-up thing, was to find a little fault on every side and let everyone go home. I felt the fog settle over the benches. I felt the worm of doubt do its work. And on the high seat, Magistrate Penhart nodded slowly, gravely, as a man nods who is being shown the reasonable middle he had already decided to take. Then they called me to the stand. I will not give you the whole of my testimony, because most of it was only the morning told plainly, the morning you already know, the wind changing, the man coming the wrong way through the crowd, the rope, the fist drawn back, the 4 seconds, the catch, the holding without a blow. I told it the way Corwin Vale had taught me to carry it, not as a man trying to win, but as a man facing a thing and telling it true. And because I was not trying to win, I did not flinch from the hard parts. Yes, I left my post. I told them why, that the post is for the stone, and the stone is for the men whose names are on it, and that I took the post with me. Yes, I moved before the blow landed. I told them why, that a guard who waits for the blow to land before he protects an 81-year-old man is not a guard but an ornament, and that I had been called an ornament that morning, and that I had decided in the 4 seconds that I would rather be a man than an ornament, whatever it cost me in a court of law. The fog thinned a little as I spoke. I could feel it thin. The plain truth told without trying to win has a way of burning fog, but it was not enough. The advocate's story still stood, half believed, propped up by the one thing I could not prove from the stand, the why of it. I could swear that Skell had come for the old man on purpose. I could not prove it. I could believe that Hessian Roque had pointed him. I could not prove it. And a court does not run on what a guardsman believes. It runs on proof. And Hessian Roque had been very, very careful, all his clever life, to leave no proof. The advocate rose to cross me. He smiled. He had saved his blow for the end, the way good advocates do, and I saw it coming, and there was nothing I could do but face it. "Sergeant Bray," he said, "you have told us a great deal about honor and posts and stones, and very movingly, and I do not doubt you believe it. But let us be plain men together for a moment. You have no proof, none, that my client came to that ceremony with any intent at all toward the complainant, do you? No proof that anyone sent him? No proof that this was anything but what it plainly was, a drunken man, a heated moment, and a guard who moved too soon and too hard and has spent these weeks being made a hero for it by a hungry press? That is the truth, is it not, Sergeant, stripped of all the fine words? You have no proof of anything more." And I had to answer him honestly, because I had sworn to, and because honesty was the only weight I was carrying. "No," I said, "I have no proof, only what I saw and what I believe." The advocate smiled wider. Hessian Roque in the front row allowed himself, for the first time, the smallest motion of his still gray face. Not a smile. He was too careful for a smile, but the easing of a man who has watched his ground hold. And then from the side of the courtroom, an old voice said clearly into the silence, "He may have no proof, but I do." And Corwin Vale rose to his feet. There was a stir in the court, and Magistrate Penhart, recovering quickly, said in his soft, heavy voice that this was most irregular, that the witness was out of order, that he must sit. But the old man did not sit. He stood at his place, small and straight, his cap in one hand now, and he looked up at the magistrate on his high seat, and there was in his gray eyes the same patience I had seen in the forecourt, the patience of a man who has stood in front of charging things before and is not going to run from this one either. "I am an old man," Corwin Vale said, "and I have not many years left, and I have spent a great many of the ones I had standing in front of things that meant to roll over me, so I will not be ruled out of order by you, sir, with respect to your robe. I have proof. The court can hear it now in front of the realm, or it can refuse to in front of the realm. Either way the realm will know which the court chose." It was beautifully done. He had given Penhart no good way out. To silence him now in that packed hall with the broadsheet men 3 deep at the back was to confess the fix in front of the whole realm. The magistrate's soft face worked for a moment, and I watched him do the arithmetic Hessian Roque had not foreseen, the arithmetic of a bought man discovering that the floor he had been paid to deliver had, in front of 1,000 witnesses, become a place he could not safely cheat. He could not silence the old hero. The realm would not forgive it. And so, with a stiffness that told everyone in the room exactly what it cost him, Aldous Penhart said that the witness might be heard. And Corwin Vale laid his proof before the court. It was not, as I had half hoped, some single shining document that swept the fog away at a stroke. The truth rarely comes like that. It came the way the old man did everything, plainly in pieces, and the more powerful for it. He had not been idle these weeks. An old man embroiled for years in a land dispute with Hessian Roque had learned a great deal about Hessian Roque, and had kept it, the way old soldiers keep things, against a day he might need it. He had the record of the Highway Commission's Eastern Survey, the official one, and it showed plainly that the great new highway did not need to cross his ground at all, that there was a second line, an easier line, a line the Commission's own engineers had marked as the better of the two, and that the line through Corwin Vale's ground had been chosen over the engineer's advice after Hessian Roque had quietly bought the title to every parcel along it, every parcel but one. Why would a man route a highway the harder way? Only because he already owned the harder way and meant to be paid a fortune for the crown to cross it. The ground was not in the highway's path by chance. The highway had been bent by money to fall across the ground. That was the first piece, and it changed the air in the room. It turned Corwin Vale, in an instant, from a stubborn old miser holding up progress into exactly what he was. The one honest freeholder a rich man could not buy, standing in the way not of a highway but of a fraud. But it was the second piece that broke the thing open. "And as for the morning at the stone," Corwin Vale said, "and whether the man who struck at me came by chance or by design, the sergeant says he cannot prove it. He is too honest. He proves only what he saw. But I have lived in the southern reach for 81 years, and I know my neighbors, and one of my neighbors is a carter named Tam Oddie, who has hauled brick for Hessian Roque's works for 11 years and has no love for the man, and who was in the city on Remembrance Eve. And Tam Oddie was in the Drover's Rest, the night before the ceremony in the back room, when Brannock Skell and his 3 companions were drinking there, and he heard, the whole back room heard, what was said to those men, and who said it, and what they were sent to do." The court was utterly silent now. Even Penhart had stopped pretending to find it irregular. "Tam Oddie is here," said Corwin Vale, "in this hall because I asked him to come, and because he is a better man than his trade has let him be. He will tell the court what he heard, and he will tell the court one thing more, a thing he saw this very morning, not an hour ago, on the steps of this courthouse. The old man turned his gray eyes then full onto Hessian Roque in the front row and held them there. He saw Mr. Roque speak to the sergeant on the steps, and being a carter and used to standing about and not being noticed, he stood near, and he heard what Mr. Roque said. "Tam, tell the court what you heard the gentleman say." And a big, slow, weathered man rose from the back of the hall, turning his hat in his hands, and in a country voice that did not know how to lie, Tam Oddie told the court what he had heard Hessian Roque say on the steps not an hour before. He told them about the offer, the withdrawn complaint, the generous settlement. And then he told them the last of it, the cold, true voice underneath, the words Roque had let slip when he thought there was no witness but a fool of a sergeant who was about to be broken. He said to him, "Sir, to the soldier," he said, "see how far the truth gets you in a room where I have already paid for the floor." The silence that followed those words was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I watched it land on the room the way I had watched the fog land, but in reverse. I watched the fog burn away all at once. Because every man and woman in that hall understood instantly what paid for the floor meant, and they turned as one creature, that single creature a crowd becomes, and they looked at the high seat, at the soft, heavy face of Magistrate Aldous Penhart, who had been about to find a little fault on every side and send everyone home, and who now sat frozen under the gaze of 1,000 people who had just been told, in a country carter's honest voice, that the floor he sat in judgment on had been bought. And then they looked at Hessian Roque. He had not moved, he was too clever to move. But the stillness that had been the stillness of a man in command had become, in the space of a sentence, the stillness of a man who feels the ground he stands on turning to water, and cannot, for all his cleverness, find the word that will turn it back to stone. He had spent his whole life never once meeting a man who would not sell. And now, in a single autumn, in a single hour, in a single packed and silent hall, the two men who would not sell had cost him exactly what I had told him on the steps they would. They had cost him everything. What followed came fast, the way such things do once the floor goes out from under them. The realm's anger, which Hessian Roque had spent a fortune trying to confuse and tire and turn aside, came back all at once, undiluted, terrible, and it came down not on the old man or on me, but on Roque and his bought magistrate and the whole rot machinery of paid floors and thin evidence and verdicts that always fell one way. A bought thing holds only so long as no one says the word in front of 1,000 people. The carter had said the word, and the realm, hearing it, would not put it down. Magistrate Penhart did not finish that morning's session. He could not. A judge accused in open court with 1,000 witnesses of selling his floor, there is no way to go on judging from that seat. He tried for a moment to bluster, to call for order, to threaten the carter with contempt, and the threat fell into the silent hall and died there, because the hall was not afraid of him anymore, and a magistrate the people are not afraid of is no longer a magistrate. Within the hour, word had gone up to the Crown's higher courts, which had long suspected Aldous Penhart and long lacked the one thing they needed, which was a proof spoken aloud where it could not be buried. By nightfall, Penhart was suspended from his seat. Within the month, the higher court had opened every case that had ever touched Hessian Roque and gone his way, and found in them a pattern a child could read, and Aldous Penhart was stripped of his robe entirely and would answer himself, in a court he could not buy, for the floors he had sold. The corruption that wears the robe is the hardest to reach. But it had reached out, this once, and laid its cold hand on the wrong old man, and the old man had not let it fall. And Hessian Roque. I will tell you plainly what became of Hessian Roque, because the niche of stories the broadsheet men tell loves a clean fall, and the truth of it was both cleaner and harder than a clean fall. He was not struck down by a thunderbolt. Men like Roque rarely are. What undid him was slower and surer. It was the law itself, the same law he had bent for 20 years, swinging back the way a bent bow swings when the weight comes off it. The survey he had bribed crooked, the highway he had bent across the old man's ground, the title he had assembled parcel by frightened parcel, all of it, once the higher court began to look, came apart in his hands. The crown does not forgive a man who tries to make it pay a fortune to cross ground he has fraudulently cornered along a public highway. That is theft from the realm itself, and the realm prosecutes it without mercy when it is laid bare. Hessian Roke's quarries were attached. His brickworks were attached. The fortune he had built parcel by parcel was unbuilt, judgment by judgment, in the long grinding way of the law, and the still gray patient man who had stood on the court steps and told me he would break me and the old man and be sorry for it. That man spent the last years of his power not breaking anyone but answering in court after court for the floors he had bought and the surveys he had bent and the freeholders he had frightened, until there was nothing left of the great builder but an old fraud's name in a long list of judgments, and a strip of marsh country ground on the eastern road that he had wanted so badly and never got. The ground stayed with Corwin Vale. The highway found the other line, the easier line, the one the engineers had marked, the one that did not need to cross an old soldier's grief at all, and was built the honest way, and serves the southern reach to this day. And there is not one family in 1,000 that crosses it who knows that it bends just slightly just there. Around a strip of ground a rich man could not buy because an old man would not sell, and a guard would not lie, and a carter would not stay quiet. As for Brannock Skell, I had thought on the morning of the forecourt that I knew exactly what Brannock Skell was, and I was wrong, and the being wrong about him is the last thing I have to tell you, and in some ways it is the most important, because it is the thing the title the broadsheets gave this whole affair never captured, and it is the thing Corwin Vale had been trying to teach me all along. Skell's complaint against me collapsed, of course, the moment the carter spoke. No advocate, however sharp, could stand in front of that hall and argue that the guard had assaulted an innocent man, after the realm had just heard, in a carter's honest voice, who had sent that man and why. The complaint was withdrawn, not by Roke's clever advocate, who had quietly vanished from the southern reach within the week, but withdrawn in the end by Skell himself. And the withdrawing of it was the first crack in the man I had taken for a simple brute, and through the crack I saw, at last, what Brannock Skell actually was, which was not a villain at all. He was a used man. I went to see him in the lockup before his hearing on the lesser charge, the charge that remained, the affray, the disturbance, the coming over the rope, which were real things he had really done and would answer for, but which were a smaller and more human thing than the realm had thought. I went because Corwin Vale asked me to. That was the first surprise. The old man, who had more cause than any living soul to hate Brannock Skell, came to me one evening in the small stone room and said, in his plain sideways way, "Go and see the big one, the one who came over the rope, before they take him to the hearing. Go and see him and look at him properly this time, not as a thing you held down but as a man, and tell me after what you see." So I went, and I looked at him properly, and I will tell you what I saw. I saw a man of perhaps 30, big and beaten down, with the broken-veined face of a man who has been drinking too long, and the slumped shoulders of a man who has worked too hard for too little and been told, his whole life, by every man above him, that he was a tool and would be used and discarded like a tool. He had come up in Hessian Roke's brickworks from a boy. He knew no other life. Roke's green jackets were the nearest thing he had to a family, and Roke's whisper, the bitter, greedy old fraud standing in the way of honest men's bread, your bread, the bread that feeds your sister's children, Roke's whisper had been the nearest thing he had to a faith. He had not known, coming over that rope, that he was striking at a hero. He had been told, for months, by the only men he trusted, that he was striking at a thief who was stealing the highway out of the mouths of the southern reaches poor. He had been pointed and drunk and used, the way a man points and uses and discards a tool, and the man who pointed him had then, the moment it went wrong, hired a sharp advocate not to defend Skell but to use him one more time, to turn his foolish act into a weapon against me, with no more thought for Skell's neck than for any other tool. "He'd have let you hang," I said to Skell through the bars. "Roke, he'd have let you take the whole of it if it had served him. You know that now." Skell looked at me for a long while with his broken-veined face, and then he said the thing that turned him, for me, from a villain into a man, which was that he did not argue, and he did not whine, and he did not ask me for anything. "I know it," he said. "I've known it 3 days he never came. All the years I broke my back for him, and the one time I was the one behind the bars, he never came. Sent the lawyer. The lawyer didn't come to get me out, he came to use me again. I could see it on him." He looked down at his big, ruined hands. "And the old man, I keep thinking about the old man. They told me he was a thief, stealing the road. I believed it because," his voice caught, and he forced it level, "because believing it meant I was the honest one, and I have not got much, soldier, but I always had that. I always had that I was an honest working man, and the trouble was other people. And it was a lie. The honest one was the old man standing bareheaded at the stone, and I came over a rope to hit him in the face, and you," he looked up at me, "you stood in front of it. You stood in front of me, a man you'd never met, doing the worst thing I ever did, and you stood in front of it and you didn't even hit me. I keep thinking if you'd hit me I could hate you and it'd be easy, but you didn't hit me, and I can't, there's nowhere to put it. There's nowhere to put what I am except down. I have thought a great deal since about that. There's nowhere to put it, you didn't hit me. I had not understood in the 4 seconds that the not hitting was a kind of mercy that would do more to the man than any blow could. A blow he could have hated and hidden behind, and used to keep believing he was the honest one and the trouble was other people. The restraint left him nowhere to hide. The restraint made him look at himself. That is the power of it, the power I had felt in my 2 hands in the gravel and not understood. Not that it spares the body, though it spares the body, but that it strips a man of the lie that he is the wronged one, and leaves him alone with the truth of what he did, which is the only place a man can begin to become something better. I told Corwin Vale what I had seen, and the old man nodded slowly, the way he did, and said, "Yes, that's what I thought you'd see, a used man." And then he said the thing that I think is the truest thing anyone said in the whole of that long autumn, truer even than the carter's words on the steps, and I have kept it the way you keep the great things. "There's 2 kinds of men do a great wrong, son. There's the kind that does it because he's rotten through, that's the gray one, Roke, the one who points the others and never comes when they're caught. And there's the kind that does it because he's been lied to all his life by the rotten ones, and has nothing of his own to set against the lie. The first kind you stop, and you bring to account, and you don't grieve over, because grief is wasted on a man who has made himself into a thing. But the second kind, the used ones, you stop them too, just as hard, but then, if you can, you give them a thing to set against the lie, because most of the wrong in the world isn't done by the rotten ones. There's never enough of them. Most of it's done by the used ones, the ones with nothing of their own to stand on. Stop the rotten ones. But save the used ones if you can. That's the harder soldiering and the better." So at Brannock Skell's hearing on the lesser charge, 2 men spoke for mercy who had every right to speak for vengeance. I spoke, the guard he had tried to make an assaulter of, and Corwin Vale spoke, the hero he had come over the rope to strike. We did not ask that he go free. He had done a real wrong, and a wrong must be answered, and Skell himself did not want to go free, which was its own kind of beginning. But we asked the court to weigh the man against the use that had been made of him, and the court, no longer a bought court, did weigh it, and Brannock Skell was given a sentence that answered his act without burying his life. A term of labor, real labor, hard and honest, the kind he knew, but for the realm now and not for Hessian Roke, on the building of the honest line of the Eastern Highway, the line that did not cross the old man's ground. He served it. I had it from the workmaster later that Brannock Skell was the steadiest man on the line, the first to the work and the last from it, and that on the day they cut the strip of road that bends around the old soldier's ground, Skell asked to be the one to set the marker stone at the bend, and set it with his own hands, and stood a moment over it bareheaded with his cap in both hands, the way he had seen an old man hold his at a different stone. A used man learning, late, from the man he had wronged. How a man stands, that is not nothing. That is, I have come to think, very nearly everything. The gray ones you stop. The used ones, if you can, you give a marker stone to set. Corwin Vale was right. It is the harder soldiering and the better. There is a little more, and then I am done, because a man telling a story that matters must also know when it is finished. And I want to bring you back at the end, to where we began, to the forecourt, and the stone, and the bareheaded head, and a guardsman standing his post. The Queen sent for me. I had not expected it. The household foot does not, as a rule, come before the Queen by name. But Queen Saraland had followed the whole of it. She follows everything. That woman, more than the court knows. And when it was over she sent for me, and I went up through the parts of the palace I had only ever stood at the doors of, and she received me plainly in a small room, with the Prince Consort Aldrich beside her and the two children, the Princess Malin and the Prince Joran, standing very straight against the wall, having been brought, I understood, on purpose to see. She did not give me a medal. I am glad of it. I would not have known how to carry a medal for the 4 seconds, which were not the kind of thing a medal is for. What she gave me was better. She said, "Sergeant Bray, I have been told you were offered, twice, a comfortable way out of all this, and that you refused it both times at great risk to yourself, because the price was a true thing you would not sell. Is that so?" "It is so, ma'am," I said. "And I am told," she said, "that when you finally laid hands on the man at the stone, you did not strike him, though you could have, and that you have not struck him since, though he tried hard to make you sorry for it. Is that so?" "It is so, ma'am." The Queen looked at me a moment, and then she looked at her two children against the wall, and she said to them, I understood, more than to me, "Then you have shown my children something I have been trying to teach them, and finding I had no good example for. That the strongest thing a man can do is the thing he chooses not to do. That power is not in the blow but in the holding of it. That an honest man cannot be bought, no matter how reasonable the price is made to sound. Malin, Joran, look at the sergeant. This is what discipline is for. It is not for standing still in a fine red coat. It is for the morning the 4 seconds come, so that a man has spent his whole life getting ready to choose well in them." And the little Princess Malin, who was 8, looked at me with her solemn dark eyes, the same eyes that had done the arithmetic of the stone, and she did a small grave thing that I will carry beside the old soldier's nod. She put her right hand flat against her chest, over her heart, the way she had seen the old men do, and she held it there. And she did not say anything, because there was nothing an 8-year-old needed to say that her hand on her heart did not say better. And then there was the next remembrance. The gray edge of autumn came round again, the way it does, faster every year, and the slow dark river came up the approach road and through the great gate, and the chairs went out along the eastern wall in the thin sun, and the footman went up and down with the tray of warm cider, and I stood my post at the inner cordon, where the velvet rope meets the iron stanchion, where there has been a bray standing for longer than there have been paved roads. There were 13 old soldiers that year, 1 fewer than the year before. They go 1 and 2 at a time, and there is no replacing them, and one of the 13 was missing from the year before, not Corwin Vale. He was there, the smallest and the straightest at the head of the line, bareheaded, his cap in both hands against his chest, doing his arithmetic of grief in front of the names, but another, a man who had sat near him, who had not lived to see the autumn. The chairs grow fewer. The stone will have to remember harder soon, and so will we. But that year, when Queen Saraland came at first light to lay the first sprig, she did a thing she had never done before, a small thing, and the court murmured about it for a month. After she had laid her sprig and bowed her head and stood her while, she did not withdraw at once to the colonnade. She walked instead the length of the eastern wall slowly in her plain mourning, and she stopped before each of the 13 old soldiers, and she took each one's hand in both of hers, and thanked him by name for what he had carried. And when she came to the smallest and the straightest, to Corwin Vale, bareheaded at the head of the line, she stopped longest, and she did not take his hand. She bowed to him. The Queen of Eldermoor bowed her head to an old freeholder from the southern reach, in front of the whole realm, at the foot of the memorial stone, because she understood, as I had come to understand, that there are men who carry the realm's hardest memory in their own bodies, and that a realm which does not bow to them while they are still here to be bowed to has forgotten what the stone is for. Corwin Vale inclined his head in return. Not a bow, he was a soldier still. Soldiers do not bow back, but the old soldier's nod, the same nod he had given me across the gravel a year before. And then the Queen withdrew, and the day became the people's day, and I stood my post. I will end where I began, with the wind of the crowd against the back of my neck, because that is where a guardsman lives, in the wind of the crowd, watching, ready still. Nothing happened that second autumn. No man came the wrong way through the river. No fist was drawn. The 4 seconds did not come. It was an ordinary remembrance, gray and cold and clean with the smell of rosemary, and I stood it the way my father stood his and his father his, and it was enough. But once in the long still hours of it, the old soldier at the head of the line turned his head very slightly and found me at my post, and across the forecourt our eyes met, the way they had met across the gravel, and he gave me the nod. Just the nod. The nod a man gives across a gulf of years to another man who has shown him that the thing he gave his life to is still alive in someone younger. And I gave it back, which a guard at his post is not supposed to do. We do not nod, we do not move. We are the men who do not move, but I gave it back. The smallest motion of my head, my eyes forward again before anyone could have seen. And it was the proudest moment of my 19 years, prouder than the Queen's room, prouder than the Carter's words, prouder even than the 4 seconds, because the 4 seconds were a thing I did, and the nod was a thing I had become. That is the whole of it. A thug came over a rope to strike a frail old man at the foot of the memorial stone, on the morning the realm remembers its dead. And a guard stepped between them and caught the fist, and did not strike, and would not lie, and would not sell. And the old man was honored, and the used man was saved, and the gray man was brought to account, and the stone went on remembering, and the post was kept. That is what the uniform is for, not the wearing, the carrying, and the carrying is the whole of the honor. I am Sergeant Halden Bray, of the household foot of the Royal House of Harrogate. I stand my post still, and when the 4 seconds come again, for they always come, once or twice in a life, I will know now exactly the kind of man I mean to be inside them. The kind who steps between, the kind who holds the blow he does not throw, the kind who carries it all the way to the stone.